Good evening. I'm waiting for Scott to turn on the microphone. He's working on it though, so while he's doing that, I'll get ready. I'll go ahead and, there we go. I was going to shout there. Backfired on me. Great to see everyone tonight. Glad we could assemble together. And as is our custom on Wednesday nights, our study is the study through the Bible, chapter by chapter, which is a great practice. There's lots of things that would get skipped over if we didn't take this line of study. So tonight we have under consideration Acts the 25th chapter. This is not a terribly complicated chapter, but there are some interesting things about it, some things that come into play. And to introduce this chapter, I, of course, want to read the last verse of Acts, the 24th chapter. So it says there, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix. And Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. So here we notice a change of leadership. So from Felix to Festus, and these were Roman appointed governors of this particular region. And it tells us there, of course, the last Wednesday night, Dwayne presented the chapter, and we saw that Paul got to give a defense to the accusation the Jewish leadership was bringing against him. And at the conclusion, Felix procrastinates with basically letting Paul go because there really wasn't anything that he could keep Paul for from a justice perspective, as Bobby alluded to in the opening announcements. But you know, there's politics that come into play too, and some of us who are older we've seen politics go on and for the good and bad for a lot of our lives, and this was no different. In fact, there was lots of politics that went on in the time of Jesus and the time of Paul in this age, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But the reason that it was explained in chapter 26 that the reason Felix left Paul as captive or wouldn't free Paul, even though the accusations against him were unsubstantiated, is that he wanted to do the Jews a favor, the Jewish leadership a favor. He wanted to appease them. And it also says that Felix was kind of looking for a bribe. Now, when you first read this, you're thinking, well, why would the Roman governor be looking for a bribe from Paul? Paul doesn't really have any money. But maybe the Roman governor became acquainted with, Paul and who his family was. Paul was well educated for his time, and certainly even though we don't read much about his family, certainly they had a measure of stature in society for him to receive the education that he did. And so maybe the governor was taking that into consideration. Maybe the governor heard about the collection that was taken up for the saints, and maybe he thought he could get a piece of that. For whatever reason, Felix was wanting, it mentions here that he was kind of wanting for a bribe. And so we see here that Paul was left in captivity, in bondage, or however that you want to call it, whatever you want to describe it as, for 2 years. Now that's quite a long time to be waiting for justice to be served, or in this sense, there's really no substantiated evidence against you, but yet Paul was being held for these more or less corruptible or political reasons. And so it doesn't really go into how Paul felt about this, but we know from previous uh, books and chapters that Paul would use opportunities such as this to preach to those around him, to talk about Jesus and talk about what he meant both to the Jews and to the Gentiles. So we really don't have to, it's no stretch of the imagination to picture Paul preaching to the guards who are in charge of his, some might say house arrest. We're really not sure the certain conditions, but we know he was granted a measure of liberty in his captivity. He wasn't free to go, but it tells us that he was allowed to have friends and those and brothers and sisters in Christ to come minister unto him while he was in this captivity. So Paul was certainly still going about the Lord's business, as we would call it today. But then we have this change in leadership. And so we can start in verse 25, and we'll read the first 5 verses. It says, now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault among him. So we see that the Jews, even after 2 years, they were still after the blood of Paul the apostle. They were still wanting to have him killed, have him murdered. And of course, they wanted to hatch the same plan that they had hatched several years ago to set up an ambush for Paul. And now they didn't tell Festus this, but they asked Festus, hey, here's an update on who Felix left bound over, and here's why he was bound over, because he's guilty of these crimes. They again brought forth this false witness against Paul to the new prudential leadership, the new Roman leadership, the new Roman governor Festus, and they really, their intent into asking Festus to bring Paul back to Jerusalem for a trial. I'll use air quotes there because the previous wasn't really a trial either, nothing official by Roman law standards or any standards by that matter. But I'm sure they didn't tell Festus that they were going to lie in ambush, but Festus has other ideas. He has other plans, and that is he's going to go back to Caesarea, and he is going to allow them to make their accusations there. So why did this new governor, so to speak, come to Jerusalem? Again, there's a lot of politics in play here. So Festus was new to the region, even though he wasn't new to probably politics and Roman leadership, but he was new to this area. And when you're assigned to govern over a Roman occupied territory, then it's not that you just go in there with an iron fist and suppress and make everybody mad, because then that leads to rebellion, and then you got to go to Rome for help, and they've got to spend money to send troops to come suppress your rebellion that you couldn't handle. So you see, it's in the best interest of the ruling Roman governor to have some political sway or some favor from the locals that he's governing, so that everybody's happy, that taxes can continue to be sent to Rome, and they don't have to spend a lot of money to govern this area. So there's a lot of politics in play. So Festus, being a good politician and a good leader, even though at times he could rule with a heavy Roman fist, he still wanted to understand the people he was governing and to some extent appease them and keep them happy so that he looked like he was doing a good job to the Roman emperor who had assigned him this task. So again, that's some of the politics in play. And so even though they appealed to him to bring Paul to another trial in Jerusalem, Festus says, no, I'm going to go back to Caesarea, and you can bring some of your folks along and you can make your accusations there. And so we see that's pretty much what we're going to find that actually happened. So we pick up in verse 6, and we'll read verse 6 through 8. I forgot to change my slides. So here's a little map of Jerusalem to Caesarea, which we actually looked at this several chapters ago. And of course, Jerusalem is an elevated city, and Caesarea is a nice place down by the coast, which people would probably want to go take vacations there. So we understand why the Roman leadership would like to spend a lot more of their time in Caesarea than they would in Jerusalem, because it is just a much more pleasant climate and pleasant place to be. So when we say up, when they use the terms up and down, they're geographically speaking, it is quite a difference in elevation. So again, in chapter 6, and when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. And when they had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. And he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. So again, we see there's another Festus is sitting on the judgment seat, which is a lawful position that he could and would use, where he can make judgments there, official judgments that had the force of law behind it. And so, of course, he had invited these Jews to come and make their allegations again. Now, the writer Luke here doesn't give details, but undoubtedly, judging by Paul's words and on throughout this chapter, there are the same accusations that they made in the previous chapter when they were pleading their case before Felix. And so we don't have details here, but Paul basically says, I'm innocent of any crimes or any accusations against the Jews, and I'm innocent against anything against Roman law, and so on and so forth. So he pleads he's totally innocent of anything and everything that the Jews have spoke against him. And so again, we see that there's more politics in play for this even to be going on. And Paul, I like, there's some question of whether Paul was in chains at these times, but Paul does make a reference to being in bondage or in bonds when he sits before Agrippa and Bernice, which we'll get to in a minute. But this is, I think, a pretty good artistic representation where you have Festus sitting in the judgment seat and probably some Jewish leadership back here in the background, and they've came and told their side or made their accusations against Paul. Now Paul is pleading his case before Festus. And so we can go on in verse 9 and see, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, so here come the politics, that is perverting justice, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So the Jewish leadership, they're saying they're listening, and here in verse 9, and Paul, they had asked him this favor, or however you want to describe it, to bring Paul down to Jerusalem so that we can judge him. And so now Festus is playing into this political favor that they've asked and setting it up. And so I think it's about, well, we'll go on in verse 10 and through verse 12. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me of, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. So I'm going to stop there. And we see that at once Festus says, hey, I'm going to send you down to Jerusalem. I think that's the moment that Paul realizes that he's not going to get justice in Festus's court either. He didn't get it in Felix's court, and he's not going to get it in Festus's court, because Festus is more interested in political favor or pandering, or however you want to call it, to the Jewish leadership than he is in justice. So we see that Paul states that he's not trying to escape punishment. If he's guilty, then he'll take the punishment for it. If he's not, then it's murder. If he's going to die for something he didn't do, now he's just trying to avoid being murdered, which we would all feel the same way. And so we see that these kind of famous words, I guess you could say, in verse 12, at least among Christians, these are pretty infamous words, I can't say the word, pretty famous words. And so in verse 12, then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar, or you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. Now, whether or not, there are some commentators that speculate whether or not Festus could have gotten out of this and still sent him to Jerusalem. This is if you want to say, chess move by Paul, to where Paul is going to make sure that he's taking this to the next level, whether it's by choice or by providence. Paul has appealed to Caesar. Now, we can read, if we can read in some historical accounts, that every Roman citizen has the right, which it was well established now that Paul was a Roman citizen, has the right of appeal from a lower tribunal or lower court in the empire to the final court of the emperor in Rome. And once the appeal has been pleaded or registered, it had the effect of stopping all other litigation or all further litigation and transferring the case to Rome itself. So this was definitely a tactic that Paul could use, and he used it once he saw that he wasn't going to get a fair trial there at Festus's court. And so Festus, whether his hands were tied or not, he abided by this plea and I guess made it official in front of everybody, that's saying, okay, that's where you're going to go to. And in some instances, maybe this lets Festus off the hook, or off the hook from the Jews who are wanting a political favor, or off the hook from keeping a Roman citizen in jail for no reason, because no one can prove anything, and it's been 2 years, he's been unjustly held. So maybe this lets Festus off the hook for these other misdeeds of his. And then we can read another, it talks a little bit about the council, that you notice that Festus conferred with his council first before he made this statement. This is not something unfamiliar with us today. Any ruler of government or stuff has counselors or people that they go to for advice. In this case, it was probably a body of men that was chosen by the governor himself, people that he trusted. maybe people that he wanted to gain political favor from there in the providence himself. Sometimes, they were captains or other people of probably higher social standing. And so they would understand this too when they appealed, when the appeal was put forth to Caesar, they would understand that, hey, this is a lawful appeal and Paul's a Roman citizen, so we can't ignore this and try to use this situation for any more political gain with the Jews. We have to concede Paul's appeal to Caesar, so to speak. So, this has been a pretty interesting turn of events here with this new governor coming into play and new politics and things of that going on. But now we have enter some more people into the picture, some more, well, it's Herod Agrippa II and his wife, Bernice. Now, if we look at the family tree here, this is the family tree of the Herodian Empire, if you will, with Herod, which was established by Herod the Great, and he had 4 sons, and they shared different leadership duties after Herod the Great was out of the picture. And then we see that one of his sons have Herod Agrippa I, and then another one, Herodias, and then we get down here, another son, Herod Agrippa II, and then it gets awkward because here's the sister that's in the picture, and it turns out these two are husband and wife. Yeah, and there's no really way to sugarcoat this. You can't say, well, this is the adopted sister, or this is the stepsister. It's just a sister. And, that's what it is. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat things. He decided to marry his sister, which obviously is not a good thing, but that's what it is. So Herod Agrippa and his sister Bernice, husband and wife, emerge onto the scene. And from what I understand, these are accurate depictions of them. They are historic depictions that have been turned up over time. I think I mentioned this before. Herod Agrippa II, there's no bust of him that could be found, even though a lot of his ancestors had busts that could be found. I mean, I'm sure there's one out there somewhere that they just haven't found yet. But so we have this coin, this time period coin, that shows an image of him. And then apparently there was a surviving bust of Bernice that they were able to establish that was her. So here we have more politics and more things going on. And so one of the things when we read in the Bible, and particularly in this chapter, is you've got the governor of Rome, but now he's being visited by King Agrippa and his wife. Well, why is there a king coming to visit the Roman governor? Well, who's in charge here? And so that's where it gets a little bit complicated. The Romans are in charge, don't get me wrong. The Roman Empire is in charge, but when they conquered different people, and at some point in time, this is way too much to go into here, but at some point in time, the Roman Empire came into the Herodian Empire and pretty much took it over, whether by force or by influence. Historians seem to say that the Herodian Empire cooperated. They saw that the Romans were too powerful, and at some point in time they cooperated with the Romans, and in turn found favor. This family tree, if you will, found favor with the different Roman empires down through time, and therefore they were allowed to continue to rule in these certain areas of Judea and such. Now, I know you can't read this map, but that's kind of the point of, I didn't want you to be able to read this map. I wanted you to be able to see the colors and the territories. This is Judea, Jerusalem, and Galilee, and Syria, and all of this. the Romans allowed King Agrippa the first and and his uncles and stuff to rule certain territories. Again, the Romans were in charge, but they allowed this family to continue to rule in these areas. And these maps changed over time. Territories were added, territories were taken away, and different players, family members were allowed to rule in certain areas. And the time we find ourselves in now, King Agrippa II and his sister wife, Bernice, were kind of put in charge of this area, are allowed to be considered king and queen of this area, even though they answered to the Romans, and the Romans allowed it to go on. But the Romans still sent a governor to make sure that everything was in place. So we have these two political figures now. They're both ruling, even though one answers to the other, but they need each other. So again, King Agrippa II, he kind of needs, King Agrippa II needs to be nice to Festus because he's the Roman authority, and vice versa. Festus kind of needs King Agrippa II to understand the lay of the land and the political landscape. And so they need to have some type of working relationship. But King Agrippa II and Bernice, they come to Caesarea, and they're coming to greet the new Roman governor and, to do all those things that people do in politics to try to play nice and maintain their position, maintain their status, and maintain their authority. And so we go back to the family tree, and they have come to greet the new Roman governor. And so at some point in time during this greeting or during this visitation, the subject of Paul comes up, this prisoner. And so we'll go back to verse 13. We'll go and continue reading verse 13 and 14. After some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix." So it seems that, maybe Agrippa and Bernice knew who Paul was. Maybe they didn't. But Festus brings it up. Maybe they were just, for whatever reason, Festus just wanted to talk and share this story, or maybe he was serious in the need. Hey, I need your help with this because I don't know what to do. Probably a little bit of both somewhere in that spectrum. But he brings it up. Say, I've got this fella named Paul, and he's been in my custody, or been in the custody of Felix for 2 years, and now he's my problem. And let me tell you a little bit about him in verse 15, starting in verse 15 through 18, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed. Well, Festus, you just kind of admitted that there's no reason to be holding Paul, at least not from any Roman law, but yet he's still your prisoner, and Felix was the same way. And so when we talk about perverted justice, this is what we're talking about. Justice has been perverted by politics of that day and age. And so we see that Paul, is Paul innocent? Well, by the Roman ruling, yes, he is, but yet he's still a prisoner officially of Rome. So that's not good by anyone's standards. And so again, the writer here is just uh, restating what has already been put forth. And then we go in verse 19. But some had questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing or not to go to Jerusalem and there to be judged according to these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man himself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. And so again, this is kind of restating some things, but it's restating things from Festus's point of view, right? He's kind of new to this arena or to this area, so he's not fully accustomed to the Jewish traditions and religions. So he is answering honestly there, and he is there. And also he seems to not have necessarily heard of this man named Jesus. So obviously Paul's been talking a little bit about that and preaching a little bit about that. So we see here that Festus, in talking to Agrippa, kind of gets Agrippa's attention and whets his appetite to hear for himself. He wants to hear. So King Agrippa, being a ruler of this area for some time now, was familiar with the Jews' customs and the Jewish traditions and things of that nature. So he would like to hear what Paul has to say. So we see that the arrangements were made for Paul to stand before Festus and before Agrippa and Bernice all at the same time. Verse 23, it says, so the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. So apparently they made a big show out of this, whether Festus was trying to show off his power to Agrippa and Bernice, or whatever the reasons were. This was with great pomp and great circumstance, and lots of other people were there too, leaders of the city and of that area. And then in verse 24, and Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with us, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. Again, he's kind of giving his own version of events here, which we would expect of any politician. Verse 26, I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him. Therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. That's a pretty obvious statement there. It's kind of funny when he says it out loud in front of everybody, but Festus has already said, yeah, I can't find any charges against him, at least from Roman standpoint of view, but he's appealed to Caesar, and now I've got to send him to Caesar, but what am I going to tell Caesar the charges are? I can't put on there he offended the Jews. Caesar would probably decommission Festus as governor if he wrote something as silly as that, because the Caesar does not care. He only cares about Roman rule and Roman law and things of that nature. So Festus, maybe he's genuinely now seeking help from others to understand what is it that I'm going to now write. I've got to write an official document, an official letter, and send it along with Paul. What am I going to put on it? So that's his appeal to King Agrippa. Maybe you can help me with this situation and help me understand what is going to be written about Paul. So I'm going to stop there. That's all that I've prepared at this time to present along this particular chapter. Like I said, not a terribly hard chapter. but it is interesting in some respects. So I'll go ahead and open it up for comments.
It almost seems like, when Paul said he wanted to go to before Caesar, that caught Festus off guard, and he didn't expect that kind of answer. And now he's dealing with the consequences of not understanding or realizing that Paul was going to do that. Now he's got to figure out what he's going to tell the emperor when he sends it.
Well, I agree with that. It was not Festus's plan when Paul said that, because Festus was trying to maneuver political favor with the Jews, and Paul's statement cut that off. And so that was not where Festus was wanting to go, but kind of where he had to go at that point in time. Bobby? Well, he was the ruling. Augustus is a name, a general name given to different Caesars. Some of them took it on and some of them didn't.
It's not Augustus.
Right.
Caesar.
Right. At this point, it was Nero, but at this point in time, when you said Augustus, everybody knew you referred to the Caesar. When we say the president, we know everybody's referring to the current sitting president and not necessarily the presidents that were previous to that person. Okay, we're done then. That was, like I said, not a complicated chapter, but an interesting chapter nonetheless. And then we'll get back into it on the 26th chapter, where I believe Nathan has that chapter, and we'll see again the goings on in this seat, this court, if you will, of ruling. We want to go ahead and extend the invitation tonight. If you are not a member of the church or haven't obeyed the plan of salvation of hearing, believing the word of God, repenting of your sins, and confessing the name of Christ before men and being baptized for the remission of sins, we invite you to do so tonight and join and be joined to the Lord's church, be added to the Lord's church. We invite you to come while we stand and sing.